Welcome to the ACAPT RIPPT webinar series. Today we're talking sensors, the second of a two-part series on sensors. We're going to go through a series of sensor talks for the first chunk of the session today, and we're going to then have a panel with each of the individual speakers where we can answer questions. So with that, I'm going to share a pre-recorded video where you're going to hear multiple sensors being discussed. Give me 1 second. Go. And we will have time for questions of the panel at the conclusion, where all of the speakers of the sessions will be there to answer your questions. So here we go with the series of talks on sensors.
Hi, my name is Valerie Block, and I'm going to talk about the Fitbit today. So there are many different types of Fitbit, which include accelerometer, gyroscope, heart rate monitors. Some of them have GPSs. I've personally worked with the ones that are probably museum pieces now, which are the Flex 2, and the Flex 1 has actually been shown to be the most accurate at measuring step count in the population that I've been working with, which is people with multiple sclerosis. The output from the Fitbit is generally thought of to be average daily step count, but you can get minute by minute data. You can also get what types of activity the person has done, the heart rate, sleep. Both of those have much more data available, including time series, which you can get online, and I'll go through that in a second. You can get the intensity of the activity, so high, moderate, or low, activity duration, calories. This is if you input the food manually, distance, elevation, the number of floors, and as I said, some models have GPS, so you can get location data. The website to the bottom left can show all the different types of output that are available on the Fitbit. So we usually wear, for research, the Fitbit on the non-dominant wrist, or you need to be consistent throughout the study. And this is because the dominant wrist usually moves more, not for ambulation, and can cause some noise. The battery life is about 5 to 7 days, and this is obviously it's rechargeable. Frequency, you can use the device at all times. Most of the devices are now waterproof, so you can wear them in the shower, and they are also for nighttime sleep. You can use this device as long as you want. I've got people in my study that have been there for 5 years using the Fitbit device. So for Fitbit accounts established by participants or research staff, daily summary data from an individual Fitbit account can be exported as an Excel or CSV file. The Fitbit also provides a public web API for accessing the data from Fitbit devices at no charge. So developers can create an app that programmatically requests Fitbit device data from participants, but only once they've authorized the app's access. So for intraday data, so the more granular minute by minute step count or heart rate, you do need this special software developers kit, or SKD, to get this data. Fitbase is a third party who can help with collecting and managing the Fitbit device data. This is for a fee though, and then data cleaning depends on your specific research question. There are pros and cons, obviously, as with every device. It's commercially available, so it's cool, which produces high adherence. It doesn't look like they're doing something for a study. It's easy to use and set up, and you get real world measures. So the data is sort of ecological. It's what's happening in their everyday life. And it's a continuous assessment, so you don't have the snapshots of function that we sometimes get in the clinic. Now, the cons are that if you want actual gait analysis, this is not what you're going to get from the Fitbit. You don't get stride width, stride length, etc. There's also potential noise, and some of the outputs need further validation depending on what diagnosis the patient has. the user does need a smartphone or Wi-Fi for this to be viable, and there are potential reactivity and biases from knowing that you have a device on that's measuring your everyday activity or sleep. So one example that we've been using is the FITRIM study, which was an observational cohort of 95 people with MS, where we recorded daily step count over 12 months and correlated this with clinic performance tests and patient-reported outcomes. And in this graph on the x-axis, you can show the time in weeks over the year, and on the y-axis is steps per day over this same period. So the EDSS is a clinic-based disability scoring system where 0 is no disability and 10 is death due to MS. And you can see that with increased EDSS score corresponding to worsening disability, and you can see that in red, there was a significant decrease in steps over the year, but neither the stable group, which was in blue, nor the subjects whose EDSS improved in green showed a significant change in steps over the year, although there was a trend towards an increase in steps for those whose disability improved. Participants who started the study with a low step count, so below our cohort median, which was around 4,800, not only showed a significant reduction in steps over the year, but there was a 4 times greater odds of clinically meaningful worsening, as defined by the EDSS. So this was a really important finding. We also looked at patients whose EDSS didn't change, those in blue, and we separated those out into the different EDSS blocks and saw that there was a significant decrease in steps or change in steps, even when the clinical EDSS didn't change over the year. So it's actually a really important prognostic measure that can potentially be modifiable from a neurorehabilitation standpoint. And then this is just a quick glossary. You can also find this on Fitbit.com of some of the outcome measures that you can get from the API. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Riggett. I'm a postdoctoral fellow and physical therapist at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab. My favorite sensors are made by Actigraph and are the WGT3X BT sensor, which is red and on the left, and the GT9X Link sensor, which is black and on the right. These are my favorite sensors due to the long battery life, ability to export raw data, reliability, cost effectiveness, and many analytics built into the ActiLife software that's used for processing. I'm now going to go through a number of different categories and break down the features that are common to both devices first, and then the features that are unique to the WGT3X and Link devices afterwards. First, both devices are water resistant and can tolerate being submerged in water for up to 30 minutes. They can also be easily cleaned with alcohol wipes, which makes them pretty robust for data collection with participants. The locations that can be worn to utilize the analytics are the wrist, waist, ankle, and thigh. Since the Actigraphs can export raw data, you can basically put them wherever you want, such as on a wheelchair wheel. Between the two devices, the WGT3X is larger and less appealing for participants to wear than the Link device, which has a screen and looks like a smartwatch. The Link screen has a customizable display that you can turn off to maximize the battery life, just show the time and data collection alerts, or show additional analytics such as step counts. The WBT3X device does not have these features, but it does have data collection LEDs to at least show when the device is active and when the battery is low. Both Actigraph devices contain accelerometers, which measure the rate of change of your speed as you move. They also both have capacitive touch sensors, which are able to detect when the device is being worn, but only works if the device is worn on the wrist. The WGT3X device contains an ambient light sensor that provides minute-by-minute light intensity values. This can be helpful for research such as studying how light affects sleep patterns, but it is affected by where the sensor is worn since it can be obscured by clothing. What is often helpful for many research studies is the inertial measurement unit, or IMU, that is in the Link device and consists of an accelerometer, gyroscope, and magnetometer. The IMU provides raw position and rotation data, but is not able to communicate with other IMUs to be able to provide kinematic data. Using the IMU substantially decreases the battery life of the device. However, the IMU is in addition to a separate accelerometer, so it can be turned off to conserve battery when you only need to collect accelerometer data. For the data collection, both sensors have the ability to export raw data in a range from 30 to 100 Hz and in the X, Y, and Z axes. This can be really helpful if you want to write your own algorithms and is not always an option on similar devices. Actigraph also calculates activity counts as a summative measure of activity in bin sizes from 1 to 60 seconds. These activity counts can be calculated using the default or low frequency extension filter, which is intended to detect lower intensity activities. These activity counts have been widely used in research, but have been pretty vaguely described by Actigraph up until February 24th of this year, when Actigraph published a preprint through Research Square. This finally describes how to calculate an activity count and makes this process much more transparent. I do want to highlight that the battery life of both devices is pretty good compared to many similar sensors. With the data collection at 30 Hz and sleep mode enabled, Actigraph advertises the WGT3X has a battery life of 27 days, but for some of our studies, we've seen it last over 50 days. The Link battery life isn't quite as good at 14 days, but it does drop all the way down to 1 day if the IMU is enabled. Lastly, I want to talk about the analytics from both Actigraph devices that can be calculated using the ActiLife software. This software is required to initialize and export the data from the sensors. These analytics include the time and number of bouts active, time spent at different intensities of activity, metabolic equivalents and other measures of energy expenditure, body positioning using the inclinometer worn at the waist or thigh, wear time using the capacitive touch sensor as well as other algorithms, sleep scoring and staging, and step counts. Most, but not all, of these analytics are versions of previously published algorithms, and ActiLife provides options to customize or manually adjust most of the algorithms within the software. However, it's not always clear how these algorithms were adapted or validated for use with the Actigraph sensors. These algorithms may not be accurate in certain populations, such as those with disabilities or children, and many of them require additional validation. Compared to many other sensors, these Actigraph devices are more cost-effective, reliable, and versatile. That is why they're my favorite sensor. Thank you.
Speed dating sensor today is the APDM Opal inertial sensors. So I'm going to give you a quick intro to those sensors and see if they're the right ones for you. So here they are, about 2 inches by 2 inches, pretty thin. I really like these sensors because they have a very, very long battery life. I don't know if you could see that. There is about 12 to 16 hours of battery in if you do logging mode, which I'll show you, and about 8 hours of battery in streaming mode. And the internal storage, which you kind of see right here, is about 8 gigabytes per sensor. So we really don't have to clear these sensors off very often, and you can just leave that raw stored data on there in case you need it or in case of a backup. Put a little bit of double-sided tape on this side, stick it on the body part, and then wrap it secure with the shear lead tape. This is the access point that you need for streaming mode, which I'll show you. Otherwise, you don't need any additional equipment or even the computer to be out there if you leave it in logging mode. Motion Studio is a software program that comes with the APDM sensors. It is to collect raw data. There are 2 other software programs, Moveo, Explorer, and Mobility Lab, that have some more plug-and-play or built-in features, but the types of data and the types of movement that you can collect are limited. You can be in synchronized logging, so this is for us when we do on-field data capture or we do something that's away from the lab or that needs to run continuously through multiple motions. And the sampling rate can go anywhere from 30 to 512 hertz, depending on the types of movement that you're trying to capture. So here you can name your sensor, and I want this to be, well, I still want it to be left foot. You can take on or off the different types of data you acquire, and you can also set a button event. So the nice thing about these sensors is they have a button on either side, and you can mark your data if you're in the field or if you're in the lab as well. Okay, once you've configured your sensors, you just pull them from the dock and you lay them flat. And they do their own internal synchronization. So what we're doing here is we're waiting for all the sensors to blink in unison. Okay, and they have. And now I am ready to collect, either in streaming or in synchronized logging. And then I'm just going to show you here. So I picked up the button one. So you can see here I'm going to start moving my sensor. And this gives you 3-dimensional acceleration and orientation. Once you're done recording, you hit convert, and you can convert your files any of the ones that you synchronize into one single file. They'll come out as .h5 files, which then you can export and process at your leisure. The data comes out in accelerations, velocities, magnetometer positions, and quaternions. And it gives you temperature as well. So you'll get 3 columns of data, except for the quaternions, you get 4 for each sensor. And from this, you can get a multitude of things. So this, I just want to show you quickly the buttons. So this is, we did this in synchronized logging, and this is a series of single leg hops. So after each single leg hop, we denoted it with start and stop. And that's kind of what you're seeing here. Okay, I'll just quickly show you how you can go from these raw accelerations, these raw signals of orientation and acceleration into something meaningful. So all the data here is raw. It's not filtered. It's not black box. If you use Moveo Studio or Moveo Explorer, excuse me, or Mobility Lab, then you will get the processed version of whatever movement you're hoping to collect. And I don't have experience with that. I only have experience with the raw data. For simple movement, so this is a study we did for baseball. We put a bunch of sensors on, and then we collected pitching data. And here you'll see that we were able to collect everything in the bullpen training session. So this is what you're seeing here is forearm acceleration, resultant forearm acceleration data. This was done with just a pretty simple processing in MATLAB. And that's because the movements are really, really discrete. So it's easy to capture what is a baseball pitch and what is not, or relatively easy. But if you want to get to more complex movements, or more complex analysis, like arm trajectories and ball release, foot contact, let's see if I got some fancier stuff here, arm configuration, throwing arm configuration at foot contact, you, for a clinical researcher, at least from my experience, you need a collaborator who has expertise in sensor algorithm development. And so how do you know whether these sensors are right for you, and what are the pros and cons of those sensors? So the nice thing is that they have a really good form factor. They're really adaptive and flexible. They have a long battery life. They have a high storage capacity, and that allows us to capture a lot of things that I am particularly interested, which is continuous repetitive movement, and specifically in a real world setting. They're very easy to sync other data with, and they're quick, easy, fast files, and you get raw data. So you have a lot of opportunity to play and to develop what you want. The downside is that you do have to develop what you want. So you need someone who really understands signal processing and dynamics, and someone that's good at coding, either in MATLAB or Python, or I guess R as well, to kind of help you with some of those projects, especially if you're doing something that is continuous data, that it's repetitive, and that you want more than just identification of movement or like basic counts. So that's it. I hope this helped, and I'll see everyone at the panel session in April. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Rich Willey, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Physical Therapy and Movement Science at the University of Montana. Today, I'm going to be talking about the iMeasureU accelerometers and how we use them in some current trials that we're conducting. So the iMeasureU device, which is what you see on the left, is mounted to the anteromedial distal aspect of the tibia. It's worn bilaterally. It's a very nice piece of hardware. It has a very large range in plus and minus 200 Gs. It's waterproof, it's shockproof, and it has a 12-hour data logging capacity at a 1600 Hertz sampling rate, which is more than adequate for what we need it for, and the sampling rate is more than adequate for what we're looking at, which is going to be a high frequency loading activity, which is typically running. You get peak tibial shock, which is, there's the raw signal that you see there. This is actually a peak tibial shock of someone during a walking trial of just a single stance. We're looking at this in military populations. And the reason why we're interested in this is that tibial shock is, or high tibial shock is associated with a risk of tibial bone stress injuries. And up to 21% of cadets will experience a bone stress injury, and in particular tibial bone stress injury during basic combat training. It's a pretty impactful injury because about 60 to 65% of cadets will be medically discharged once they experience this injury. To mount the sensor, it's can be used mounted using the proprietary mounting system that you see on the right, which is just basically a rubberized strap. Most of our participants find it to be pretty uncomfortable, so we've kind of come with our own mounting technique, which we find it seems to work much better and much more comfortable. So we use toupee tape under the sensor to attach it to the skin. And then we use 3 wraps of Coban over top of it, and it seems to be far more comfortable, and our participants can wear it for several hours without complaints. To collect the data, you have two different options. You can either collect the data on board, which is the system or the method that we use, or you can stream it to a tablet. The onboard way is in our opinion, is the way to go, because the person can then leave the range of the Bluetooth device, the iOS system. They don't have to carry the iPad with them. They can go off in the field and do an activity, and then they can come back, and then you conclude the trial at the end. The data are then uploaded to a black box kind of algorithm that is proprietary to IMU, to iMeasureU, and they use this this iterative temporal approach to identify stance phases, and then they come up with iMeasureU step metrics of impact load and impact asymmetry, which is then accessible via their website on your laptop. It's a pretty slick system, and it's very smooth to use, and you can collect data on a lot of people at the same time. We get a couple main outputs from this, and the one would be tibial shock, which is what you see on the left, and you get it on both the right and the left leg, and you get an asymmetry metric. And as you can see, this person's pretty symmetrical. This is during a walking trial. You also get bone stimulus, which is, I'll talk about the next slide, but you get bone stimulus on both the right leg and the left leg, and you get the overall intensity of the activity as a whole. Bone stimulus is calculated using kind of a bit of an older model, but and you can access this via their white paper. And what it does is that it factors in the number of steps you take during a trial and multiplies that as a factor of the peak tibial acceleration that's garnered from the device per step, and that gives you your bone stimulus. And that basically is trying to get an idea of how much stimulus there is for both bone breakdown, but also bone formation. And it tracks it over the course of several sessions and weeks and months if you're looking at athletes over the course of a season. We're currently looking at these devices, we're using devices during lab trials, and you can see this person, our people are wearing weight vests. We're validating the devices now, and we're having people walk and run with load carriage up to 75 pounds. We're looking at differences between males and females. We're also doing a field trial, and that's where these devices come in really handy because we can collect a lot of data at the same time. We have people walk up this mountain behind our campus and then walk right back down with it while they're carrying some pretty heavy load carriage. We find the devices work really quite well in the field. Some pretty nice pros. We find it to be very excellent hardware. It's lightweight, so there's not a lot of movement artifact. The interface is quite easy to use on the iPad and also on their website. You can collect a lot of data from a lot of different participants at the same time. The data download easily, and you can do some batch processing. And we find the algorithm for event detection seems to be quite robust. The scientific underpinning linking peak tibial shock to bone loads is a little bit questionable, primarily because it doesn't really account for muscle forces, which is going to be significant. So there is that. And the event algorithms don't also do quite as well if you use an alternative placement, for instance, putting the device a little bit more proximal on the person, which you might have to do if you're wearing a big boot. So for instance, if you're in the military or if you're a wildland firefighter, you're typically gonna be wearing a high boot. And so you're not gonna be able to put it on the ideal location here. And the strapping system, as we mentioned, seems to be pretty uncomfortable for most people. Because of this weak relationship between peak bone loads and tibial shock, what we're kind of finding is that it just seems to be these devices seem to be very excellent gross metric of applied external load on the person. We're a little bit cautious about saying that this is actually measuring tibial bone loads. All right, and that kind of does it. So thanks a lot, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on these devices. Thanks very much.
Hello, my name is Victor Chu, and I'm an assistant professor at UCSF. Welcome to the summary of the ActiPAL. The ActiPAL comes to us from PAL Technologies, PAL standing for Physical Activities Logging. And that is exactly what this ActiPAL monitor is designed to do. That is quantify our free living daily physical activities. When you move, it moves, calculating and discriminating the periods of time spent sleeping or sitting, standing or stepping, even cycling or riding in a car. The current model generation is the ActiPAL 4, which works in concert with version 8 of their software suite that is Windows and Mac compatible. The ActiPAL monitor itself is just 23.5 millimeters wide, 43 millimeters long, and only 5 millimeters thick, totaling just 9.5 grams. This slim design means it's easily and comfortably worn on the thigh. How that works is the monitor is positioned on the right thigh, about a third of the way down on the midline between the hip and the knee. We place the monitor inside a finger cot. You can see on the left, this is for extra waterproofing purposes. The stick figure here was simply drawn on to maintain appropriate monitor orientation. After about a 9 centimeter long section of tegaderm is then placed over the ActiPAL, as you can see in the middle. And when you remove the serrated cover, that leaves our attached and sealed ActiPAL on the right. This system is minimally encumbering to the wearer, who doesn't have to worry about taking it on or off. They can now exercise, sleep, shower without worrying about affecting the monitor at all. The version 8 software I mentioned earlier has 3 primary functions: device management, data visualization, and data processing/export. These functions are accomplished by PAL Connect, PAL Analysis, and PAL Batch. An ActiPAL purchase includes a lifetime license for this software suite, and this entitles the user, 1, to install the software on any computer, and 2, lifetime software updates. The PAL Connect portion is the monitor management, that's checking battery life, initializing, and/or downloading any recordings. You can connect an ActiPAL individually to your host computer or purchase a dock to charge and initialize multiple monitors at once. The ActiPAL frequency of collection is by default 20 Hertz, but that can be increased to 40 Hertz, and the recording capacity is approximately 14 days. You can set to record immediately or at a fixed future date. Data visualization is handled by PAL Analysis. ActiPAL uses their proprietary intelligent activity classification routines to discriminate between movement types, for example, sleeping or riding in a car. There are several choices when it comes to figures, shown here in the bottom right. Here are some visual examples of what's called the event spiral view. These are 2 different people who have worn an ActiPAL for several days. Each ring of the wheel is a complete valid day measured, and we have our legend above: sitting/lying time, sleep time, standing, stepping, etc. Even with a superficial glance, it's easy to see the left person has much more standing time, shown in green, whereas on the right, we see considerable sedentary time across the days in yellow. Taking it a step further, the software can characterize sedentary time by its duration. What was sedentary time in yellow can now be broken up into different bout durations, anywhere from less than 30 minutes to those lasting more than 4 continuous hours. Finally, PAL Batch is our data processing, or maybe more appropriately, data export, where you can work with either your raw or processed data. Here's a quick snapshot of the multitude of options available, again, either raw or processed, all days or just valid days, or you can extract your number of steps, cadence, sedentary time, METs, sit-to-stand transitions, etc. You can also even export PDF reports of any of the data figures that you can see with the PAL Analysis data visualization. With respect to strengths, there's incredibly low burden for the wearer, very easy for a clinician or researcher, point and click, near automatic processing and export. The ActiPAL is objective and highly reliable with highly reported validity. ActiPAL has been used extensively by researchers worldwide in over 2,500 published articles and over 150 clinical trials, from preschool age to 90 years old, in healthy cohorts in a wide array of conditions and across slow to fast walking speeds. By cons, I mean more to bring up just considerations. Depending on your budget, these monitors could become expensive if you need a large number in active rotation. As a reminder, these are quantifying posture and activity, not a kinematic assessment by any means. It's still just the one monitor. Its ability to estimate activity intensity is yet to be fully determined externally, where prediction of METs based on cadence can result in over and underestimations. And as with all activity identification methods, including waking wear identification, no method is universally accurate and accepted. One could still consider potentially a sleep diary as an external form of quality control. Thank you very much for listening.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rich Souza. I'm faculty in the Department of Physical Therapy and Rehab Science at UC San Francisco. And today I'm going to be talking to you about a couple sensors that are offered by Axivity, the AX3 and the AX6. The AX3 is a triaxial accelerometer, hence the 3 in AX3. And so the AX6 is a triaxial accelerometer plus a triaxial gyroscope. The dimensions are listed below, essentially converting to inches. The long side of the accelerometer is somewhere around 1.25 inches long. They do have a wrist-worn watch that you can pop the puck into a sleeve if you want to collect data at the wrist. For our research, we've chosen to not use this and apply it more at the specific sites where we're interested in the accelerations. The costs are pretty inexpensive. The AX3 is about $120, the AX6 $180. Axivity is a company in the UK, so these are numbers converted from euros, and obviously you have to get shipping to wherever you're at. Here are the parameters that are available for the Axivity sensors. The frequency of acquisition is quite broad. You can get anywhere from 12 hertz all the way up to 3200 hertz. 3200 data points per second for long periods of time creates a massive amount of data. So there are some challenges with processing if you're going to collect data that high. The accelerometer has pretty broad bandwidth. This is all configurable, and you can have any combinations of these parameters that you choose, anywhere from plus minus 2 Gs on the accelerometer all the way up to plus minus 16 Gs. What we have found is most activities of daily living really live between that plus minus 16 Gs. So we're able to get everything from running and jumping and stairs and walking, and 16 Gs is usually appropriate for being able to acquire all that data. The gyroscope is configurable between 125 and 2000 degrees per second. The wear time, depending on these parameters, will vary. So the method that we use is the 6-axis accelerometer and gyro at 100 hertz. This will give us 7 days of wear time before the memory chip fills up. Usually at 7 days, the battery is still fine, but the memory chip is full. If you weren't as interested in the gyroscope and you can go down in resolution a little bit, you can use the triaxial accelerometer at 50 hertz all the way up for 34 days. And again, you can configure this in any of the parameters that you want. These are just a couple of examples. The way we use it in my research is we apply the AX6 to the anterior thigh and we cover it with Tegaderm. The device itself, the sensor itself, is water resistant up to 1.5 meters depth of water, but the Tegaderm is a nice additional layer of water protection when people are taking a shower, so it's not going to get wet at all. It also almost hides it from them. We apply this to people in our laboratory when we're doing biomechanics testing. We give them a stamped envelope to take home, and then we actually call them after a week and remind them to put it in the envelope and send it back to us. And it's not uncommon for people to just completely have forgotten that they have it on their anterior thigh. So we find it quite successful in getting some pretty good data. I want to show some examples of activities. This is the AX6. I'm showing you just the accelerometer data at 200 hertz plus minus 16 Gs. On top are the components, the X, the Y, and the Z components, and on the bottom is the vector resultant magnitude. So you can see that the resultant magnitude is peaking up around 2,500 milligravies. That's the same thing as 2.5 Gs. So somewhere around 2.5 Gs during walking is what we're seeing. During running, you can see the activity here. Again, this is about 7 seconds, 200 hertz accelerometer plus minus 16 Gs, and the resultant vector magnitude at the bottom. You can see we got some peaks in the 10, 11 G range. So that, oops, sorry, skipped this one. The stair data. This was done in the laboratory, so you can see that it's annotated. We have some stairs up and stair down on the top panel on the components. If you look at down stairs hard, you can see that the person had particularly one step that was a pretty high impact. The resultant vector magnitude on the bottom shows about 16 Gs of peak acceleration during that activity. So here are the pros and cons of the AX6. The pros is it provides raw accelerometer and gyro data. As I was looking for a sensor that would fit my needs, I found a lot of the commercially available devices have filters in them, or they have some black box steps that are taken where you don't get the raw data. But here we're able to get raw data, and I really appreciate that. You also can get really high resolution. If you want to collect up to 3,200 hertz, you can do it. It's going to make a lot of data, and the battery will die faster. The memory chip will fill up, so your wear time will be reduced, but you can get that. And plus minus 16 Gs we find has been really good for almost all activities. It's also very small profile, it's inexpensive and water resistant. On the con side, as I've alluded to a couple of times, it creates a massive amount of data. Data reduction is not trivial. We've developed some custom approaches that allow us to interpret such a large amount of data, but it doesn't come with software that is easily used to reduce this data. So you're gonna have to come up with solutions on your own. There are some clipping with high impacts, but it's got to be really high impact jumping. Most activities, it's fine. There's no user interface like with the Fitbit or other devices that might encourage the patient to either do more activity or different activity. So it's kind of completely blinded to what's being recorded. It's also limited between 7 and 30 days. So if you wanted to get longer term throughout an entire year, you'd have to do multiple cycles of using this. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and look forward to hearing about the other sensors.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Brown at the University of Washington. Our lab is currently studying mobile health based exercise interventions in individuals with interstitial lung disease. And due to the nature of their disease, they're at risk for blood oxygen desaturation, especially during physical exertion. So we want to be able to record oxygen saturation continuously during every exercise session over the course of the intervention period. And we use the oxygen saturation data not only as a study endpoint, but more importantly, as a way for us and for the patient to monitor their exercise tolerance and make adjustments as necessary to the exercise regimen or to their supplemental oxygen. So what does the sensor record? We are recording an estimated measure of arterial blood oxygen saturation, which I will refer to generally as just SpO2, which is the percentage of hemoglobin binding sites occupied by oxygen. This is provided by a single primary sensor, non-invasively without arterial puncture, via devices that measure transmittance of light through cutaneous tissue that has a pulsatile blood flow, like the fingertip or the earlobe, or that measures light reflectance off of cutaneous tissue, for example, at the forehead, or other locations where that's possible as well, but the forehead is most common. At present, there are really only two choices available for the measurement of SpO2 during home or community-based exercise when an individual isn't at rest, and that is the fingertip sensors or the forehead sensors. Okay. A system that includes a forehead sensor is pretty common in the hospital and clinical exercise testing setting because it's less sensitive to motion artifact and it has the most accuracy when you compare it to arterial blood gases. There's also very expensive non-invasive reflectance systems available in hospital systems, and these allow for higher quality monitoring at rest and during mobility. But these are even bulkier and they're much more expensive. Medical grade devices that incorporate forehead and fingertip sensors also include signaling processing algorithms and software add-ons. And this can minimize the motion artifact and also the impact of different skin tones. Forehead systems, though, are bulkier, more expensive, they're wired. So it's not as feasible for prolonged use during exercise that's not stationary. So what we have been doing for home exercise sessions is to monitor SpO2 with a medical grade fingertip pulse oximeter by Nonin. And this one that we use is called Nonin Connect 3230. Or we use the Nonin wristox 3150, which has a wrist piece like this that can go onto the wrist or upper arm. And it has an attachment for the fingertip. So the wristox is this piece and this fingertip attachment. Other option, like I said, is this Nonin 3230, which is just at the fingertip. It's all contained there at the fingertip. The advantage of this one is that this piece at the fingertip is rubber, smaller, easier to keep on there, and the wire runs to the watch component. The other important part about this wristox is that this white cord that connects to the fingertip sensor can instead be replaced with a wire that connects to a forehead sensor. So for forehead sensor, you have a wire that runs to this wristox device, okay? Neither of these are available to the consumer because they are a medical device requiring a physician prescription. The 3230, this just fingertip one, is about $250 or so. The wristox is more expensive. It's somewhere around $600. And the sensor for both, like I said, is at the fingertip, unless you get the special forehead one, which you can buy separately, and they are little adhesives that can make them single use. And they both use a pure sat signal processing algorithm by Nonin. And like I said, the major difference is the fingertip piece is smaller for the wrist docs. This little piece is smaller than this somewhat bulkier piece on the fingertip. So for exercise, some individuals will find it's more reasonable to keep this on the fingertip, especially if they're doing exercise that involves the use of their hands, and that it's just not possible with this on their finger in some cases. And the Nonin wrist docs is also, this one is also more popular for sleep studies because it's easier to keep that on than a bigger, bulkier thing. But the two major advantages to both of these Nonin devices is that they permit continuous measurements. And this is shown as frequent as second by second when the data is downloaded. And this is important for monitoring during exertion, where we want continuous collection, not just spot checking. They're wireless and they communicate directly via Bluetooth to interface with an inexpensive and pretty user-friendly smartphone application, which I'll show you on my smartphone here. The Nonin Connect, which is the name of the app. And that's a free app that you can put onto your smartphone or the patient's smartphone, the subject's smartphone. Nonin Connect gives you that visual display of data, on the smartphone. And it's also how we access that second by second time-stamped SpO2 file. And those are directly downloaded as .csv files. So in the slide here, you can see that data exactly as it looks downloaded in the .csv file, where you have a timestamp second by second, and then SpO2 in one column, and then beats per minute for heart rate in one column next to that. And then this pulsatility index, this PAI percentage. And that PAI percentage really gives you an idea of the quality of the signal. And the algorithm within Nonin will actually do some cleaning prior to you even seeing that data. It will remove values where the pulse amplitude index, the PAI, is too poor, and these will show up as gaps in the data. Typically, if the PAI is 0 to 20% is what you'll see there. Greater than 0.3 is a strong signal. Between about 0.1 and 0.3 is probably okay, and less than 0.1 is not valid. And so the algorithms already within Nonin will clean those up pretty well, we've found. And it keeps the investigator from having to do all of it, which is great. But we still go through and manually check values that are low. And then we have criteria that we use for cleaning that data further if we see things that, heart rates that aren't physiologic occurring at the same time, or other changes, sudden jumps that don't make any sense at all based on what the person was doing activity-wise during that recording. So, and so we keep that data cleaning process in a separate file, record exactly how it's been cleaned so we can keep track of that and stay consistent. So what are the steps that we use to get the final reduced data from this is the part where it's not as great. So unfortunately, there's not a program yet that makes the high volume of data super usable. Like, for example, Fitbit program does for Fitbit data. They don't have that yet. We developed a method in GraphPad Prism to do a frequency analysis where we can define binning for SpO2 values for each session, and that gives us the levels of desaturation that are occurring in individuals, from none to mild or more severe. And I've got a slide that can show you what that looks like here. So for a patient in an exercise session, or in this case a group of exercise sessions within a week, we could represent how much time they spent in different zones of desaturation in this sort of pie graph frequency analysis, which gives us a nice look at the data. The other thing that we can do with this data, since it's all time stamped, is that we can show this over a single exercise, test or an exercise bout, an exercise session, minute or second by second, what the SpO2 values look like and what they look like relative to heart rate, shown in the red line here. And generally for individuals that desaturate with exercise, of course, as you expect, when heart rate goes up to higher intensities of exertion, that's when they have more trouble with desaturation. And then as they bring that heart rate, that exertion down and that heart rate comes down, that starts to recover. So we can track this with our patient subjects and adjust our target heart rate zones to put them really right at the sweet spot of where we think they should be for their exercise prescription. And let's talk about the pros and cons of this sensor to finish up. Well, the pros are that it connects via Bluetooth to a smartphone. So this smartphone app is pretty user-friendly. And like I said, we can obtain raw second-by-second data in Excel format. So that's nice. It's also relatively affordable for a study budget. The cons, though, are that the fingertip device can be a little difficult to get good, consistent readings in situations where perfusion isn't great, like in cold environments or individuals that have Raynaud's phenomenon. Second, the fingertip devices don't always perform as well as the forehead sensors during physical activity due to motion artifacts. So, it's not as easy to keep a fingertip pulse oximeter on continuously during exercise, particularly for some exercise modes. So, the forehead one really does, that placement is ideal. But again, it's not, it really depends on what you're interested in studying, whether that's necessary or not. And lastly, you should be aware that at present, the Nonin Connect app does not, that again connects with the wrist ox or the fingertip pulse oximeter 3230, 3280 rather. They do not, 3230, sorry. They do not, Nonin Connect is not available on Android. So it can't be used on an Android platform. So this presents a little bit of a problem when we want to put this on our study subjects' personal cell phones, and we end up having to get Apple phones for them to be able to use for the study. So that's one thing that hopefully Nonin will work out soon, because it needs to be expanded to Android platforms. So that's a con as well. But overall, this has been a really useful system for us to be able to study oxygen saturation as well as work with the remote monitoring piece, which is so important to the type of research that we're doing. All right, thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions when we have our panel discussion.
All right, that concludes the speed dating for sensors, all the individual talks. If I'd like to invite the panelists to join me back here, and we can open up to questions. I appreciate there's some coming through the chat, and it looks like Stephanie just was answering a pretty in-depth one about patients with ALS having high variability of control, and whether the Actigraph would be an appropriate sensor. Anyone else has, I see that Stephanie did answer that. Anyone else have any thoughts of sensors that they represent being potentially a viable sensor for that solution? All right. Let's go ahead and open it up to other questions. We can use the raise the hand function now that we're in the panel, so it doesn't have to all go through the chat. So if you have any questions for the panel about any of the sensors we've talked about today, compare and contrast, specific issues relative to your research, we're happy to answer those now. All right, well, people are getting those together. We did have a couple of questions that came through prior to the start of them. One had to do with whether or not the sensors had been commonly used or validated in pediatric populations. Can any of the panelists speak to use of sensors in pediatric populations?
I'll say for the Aftergraph devices, I do know that they have been commonly used. I personally haven't worked with pediatric populations, so I'm not as familiar with the validation. I know that they Aftergraph devices have been around for decades, and so they're one of the most well-validated sensors, just in terms of the number of studies, not necessarily the success always of the algorithms, but just the number of times that they have been validated for different uses in populations. So it's very possible they've been validated before, and research has probably been done on that, but I'm not sure exactly how well they've done.
Yeah, just to second that, I do know of several studies in peds, both looking at sleep time and activity using the Actigraph, where it has been in peds population. I don't know the validation steps taken there, but yeah.
Similarly, I think with the Fitbit, it has been used in at least pediatric MS populations I've seen to improve physical activity, but I'm not familiar with the data as well in the pediatric population. But it's from Dr. O in Canada.
Yeah, I would say from an accelerometry standpoint, we're looking at for running, they've been used quite a bit in pediatric running research. I'm just not as familiar with that literature though as adults, so I can't really comment too much on it.
I'll ask people can understand me. I'm sorry, I lost my voice. I think it's less the population and more how the population moves and what types of movements they're doing. So an example in sport would be like baseball pitching. The sensor, depending on how the parameters of the sensor and the speed at which the pitcher is throwing, that validates or invalidates the movement. So it's not necessarily the person wearing the sensor, but what they're doing while they're wearing it.
Really good point, Kristen. Thanks. Other questions for the panel? Another one for Rich, actually. Rich, I'm interested in this blue trident. I was speaking with Irene Davis about it at a recent conference and wasn't as familiar with it. I know when you collect it at very high resolution, the wear time is relatively short. Can we change, like if I don't care about 200 Gs, if I don't care of anything above 50 Gs, and I reduce the sampling rate, do we know how long that can be worn away from the laboratory?
Yeah, they have, I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but yeah, you can. And I think that when you use there are two different ways to collect the data. And one is when you're streaming it directly to the device. I think with that, you have much more ability to do that. You can also limit the number of sensors that you're doing. So, you can, the magnetometer, you can basically turn that off, as well as the gyroscope, and that helps quite a bit as well. They do have a new sensor coming out soon that I believe will store data or log data for 24 hours, which is really impressive at that sampling frequency. So, and I believe that's coming out in the next month or so. Yeah, that is a concern. It'd be awesome if you can collect data for several days. But as you mentioned in your talk, that's just an obscene amount of data, and picking through that is really tough. So we end up dividing our trials into quartiles so we can process the data a little bit more effectively.
Yeah, even just visualizing it on a single screen becomes a challenge, right? I mean,
yeah,
we've got all these log plots just to try to be able to evaluate some of the high loading events, because they just get completely dwarfed by the low G events throughout a long period of time. So yeah.
I mean, like even to open up and like say Microsoft Excel, a 30-minute file, it crashes Excel. So you have to visualize it with other programs than that if you're just looking at the raw signal. So it is a lot.
Another question came through. I believe the question's asking about people with Parkinson's disease. Does anybody have any experience with your sensor being used previously in that population?
So I haven't personally used the Actigraph sensors in Parkinson's disease, but a lot of the algorithms I've previously, some of the ones that I've written were based off of tremor detection from Parkinson's disease. And I know that at the wrist, Actigraphs have been used to be able to try to quantify tremor, mostly changes in tremor over time. One thing I'll say with Actigraph devices is that they definitely don't have as high of a sampling frequency and as big of a range as some of the other devices that we've been talking about. So they're good for kind of longer detection and overall trends than those kind of really detailed specifics. They have been used, but I think probably not for quite as detailed of an analysis as some of the other sensors have.
One overarching issue I'd just like to bring up is the this idea of bandwidth and how many G's bandwidth we need to acquire activities of daily living or sporting activities. And you know, I noticed that I mentioned several times in my talk that 16 G's seemed appropriate for most activities, but I want to stress that's placing it on the anterior thigh on a muscle belly. If you are putting this at the distal tibia, Rich, I imagine your accelerations probably exceed 16 G's in the individual components. We saw some clipping during really high activities, but again, we're more proximal where there's this natural kind of attenuation that happens. So you're probably experiencing greater G's distal. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing G's between 35 and 45 G's when they're going downhill, and that's during walking trials. So, and and what we've done is we've looked at doing a proximal placement because of the boot issue in our population, and just by doing that, I think it reduces the signal by about 15 to 20%, and the event detection algorithm is not quite as robust either. So yeah, the placement really makes a big difference. And you know, for us, we're really interested in tibial loads, and so that's why we're mounting it on the tibia. And are you doing yours on the thigh? Are you interested in I'm guessing knee loads?
Yeah, no, we are, and it's been a little bit of a struggle because we want to place it some place where it's comfortable, where somebody will wear it for 7 days and tolerate it. But if you place it on an area of soft tissue, that's almost like a natural filter, right? So we're actually losing some of the highest frequency loading there as well. And the more proximal that you go, the more kind of shock attenuation is going to happen naturally through the joints and et cetera. So the place where we've really done most of the work is in hip osteoarthritis. And so hard to put it on like the greater trochanter or iliac crest and think that that's going to be tolerable for 7 days of sleeping on this thing. The anterior thigh is something that we stole from University of Colorado group that had been doing that. Jen Stevens' lab group had been doing that for a long time, anterior thigh. And so we knew that would be tolerable. And so we're using that with the understanding that, you know, a soft tissue mounted accelerometer has some weaknesses. Well, we're up to our last minute before the end of the webinar. Is there any questions either from the panel that have questions for others on the panel or questions from the audience to the panel? All right, well, this webinar is going to be recorded and available on the ACAPT website. I don't know if Debbie, you're able to unmute, or Jamil, and say where people are able to find that, but I know it is findable.
Yes, so if you Google RIPPT, RIPPT consortium, or where you went to sign up for this, all of our webinars eventually, it takes us about a week or so to get these up, and they're all linked to the RIPPT consortium webpage. And this has been, I know you all agree, a fantastic presentation and a resource that I'm sure will get many, many hits for many times to come. I know I'm going to come back and revisit it and suggest people come. So please, please, please. Yeah, Jamil just put the link in the chat. It just takes us a little time to process this and get it up, but
thank you so much to the speakers. It is a valuable resource that we will appreciate for many, many years to come, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Rich and all.
You're welcome. And thank you to the rest of the panelists, all your efforts in putting those together. And of course, Jamil for making the magic happen behind the scenes.